Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everyone along this evening to hear from James Van Dyke, who's going to talk to us about long-necked turtle conservation on the Bellarine and their program, citizen science program called 1 Million Turtles. But first I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Wadawurrung people, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also the traditional owners from all the lands where the viewers might be coming from, and including the land, your land that you're on, James, up on the Murray. Yorta people up there, or
here it's a mix of Wiradjuri on New South Wales side and Doodaroa on the Victoria side.
Okay, great. Yeah, so welcome everyone. Yes, this is actually part of a project we've got called Project Long-necked Turtle. It's working with private landholders to fence off farm dams and revegetate around them. And protecting the long-necked turtles is just one good reason why we should be doing this work. So over to you, James. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and give a little bit of a background.
Sure. Thanks, Sophie. So my name is Dr. James Van Dyke. I'm a senior lecturer of biomedical science at the Wodonga campus of La Trobe. I actually teach a lot of human anatomy and physiology because I have a background in teaching to pre-med students in America, where I am from. But I've always been a biologist who really focused on more reptile physiology and ecology and evolution and conservation. I've just always been fascinated by reptiles and sharks and things like that. And since I've been here, turtles have become a real big focus for me. And in addition to the acknowledgement of country Sophie's done, I also want to acknowledge the Yorta Yorta and the Wamba Wamba and Ngarrindjeri people, because I've done a fair amount of work on either their lands or with some of them on some of the projects I'm going to talk about here today. And I also want to acknowledge a number of collaborators and funding sources that are supporting our 1 Million Turtles program. So you can see the universities listed here and also these government funding sources. So we're kind of focusing on long-necked turtles. We've done most of the work I'm going to talk about today is on the Murray, on all three species that we have, the long-necked turtle and the Murray River short-necked turtle and also the broad-shell turtle, but we'll focus on this eastern long-neck here today. And here's some just basic information about them. These turtles are really, really cool. They are unlike anything I used to work with in America, just because of how diverse they are. As we were talking with Andrew a minute ago, we often see them in farm dams and also in drying wetlands. They really, really like temporary wetlands that kind of flood and dry on some kind of a cycle. They're highly carnivorous. So I've got this note on the bottom. They eat a lot of aquatic insects, even larval mosquitoes. They'll eat baby yabbies, tadpoles, frogs, fish, all kinds of stuff, but almost all animals. And there's some evidence that they go into these temporary wetlands when they flood to just eat whatever insects start eating all of the aquatic vegetation as it grows up. Also, I should note, if anybody has any question at any point, I'm happy to take them either in the chat or if you want to shout out, that's fine. Just interrupt. It's no big deal. These turtles will wander really long distances across land to access different wetlands. I was called one time when I was working in Gunbower. We were called by a landholder who's about 10 Ks from Gunbower Creek or any of the other waterways. And she had been digging in her garden and just found a juvenile long-necked turtle just buried about 10 centimeters down in the dirt. And it must have just been wandering from wetland to wetland, found, itself getting a little bit dried up and just buried itself right down. And this is what we call estivation. So they sit there underground and they just wait for it to rain, and then they'll come back out and continue their journey. And I saw something like this one time in Queensland when I was out actually looking for snakes one night, and we had a little bit of a rain shower. There's no water around, just a couple of temporary creeks, and all of a sudden there were long-necked turtles crossing the road. It's not really desert where I was, but just didn't expect to see them out like that. And unfortunately, because we see them crossing roads, we often see them get smashed on the roads, and that's a real threat to them because it hits the adults in particular. As I said, I'm going to focus on the Murray, and where we've got our three species, the eastern longneck, the Murray shortneck, and the broadshell turtle. We've seen these major declines that were identified from the 1970s to the current time. And you can see that the broadshell turtle is the rarest. It's actually listed as endangered in Victoria. It's a totem animal, or a totem to the Yorta Yorta people in particular, so really important to them. But it hasn't actually declined as far as we can see. The long necks and the Murray short necks have declined quite a bit in some places. But this was only recorded by Bruce Chessman at one area near Yarrawonga. And one of the things that we set out to do about almost 10 years ago now was to see how bad the situation was over the broader Murray catchment. And so back then, I spent a whole bunch of time going around as many rivers and wetlands as I could on the southern Murray catchment. You can see all the spots here. And you can see all the places that we trapped for turtles to see where we could find them, with some clusters where we're doing more intensive work around Gunbower here. You can see that we haven't really hit very much on coastal Victoria, and so that's something that we really need additional data from, and really keen to talk to you all about. This graph gives us an idea of what kinds of numbers we'd see. And so in blue is our short neck turtles, red is the long neck turtles, and green is the broad shells, which again, always very rare pretty much anywhere we are. This is going from upstream on the Murray catchment, so close to Albury or tributaries into the Murray up here, all the way down to the ocean in South Australia. And you can see that our numbers decline as we go closer to South Australia. And in fact, there's some places we're not catching any turtles at all. And one in particular I'll point out is Calperum Station. We spent 5 days there and we didn't catch a single turtle over that time period. And just to give you an idea of what this catch per unit effort means, this number, this 0.9 or a bit above it, would mean you're catching about 10 turtles, or sorry, you're catching about 240 turtles across 10 traps in one day, is what that number would represent. So that would be catching quite a large number of turtles. And we have some places where we get some pretty high numbers like that. But we have a lot of places where we don't catch any. And some of these I'll point out too are up in the dividing range, like up near Colobon and Kyneton, and it may just be too cold to have very many turtles up there. They're probably still there, some long necks there, but just not many of them. Historically, from the 1970s, our estimates, if you calculate the biomass, was somewhere around 115 turtles per hectare in the Murray. So this is a hectare, it's 100 meter by 100 meter square, and this is what 115 turtles could look like in that. I want to point out this is a really rough estimate, and there's some really interesting op-eds, so opinion pieces in newspapers from South Australia between 1890 to 1950, where individual fishers would write their experiences with turtles as a pest. They were really viewed as eating Murray cod spawn, and so they were basically killed on site. And at some points, there were even bounties on them in South Australia. And some of these guys report killing up to 5,000 turtles in several months. And these numbers, like if we're thinking about that back then, and in the 1970s, these were the kind of numbers that we saw. These numbers could have been even higher, because it's really, really difficult for turtles to repopulate areas over that kind of a time period. So there may have been even more turtles in the system beyond what we can imagine. And some of the estimates worldwide for freshwater turtles are that sometimes their biomass can be as high as things like wildebeest on the Serengeti. That's a lot of turtles, and they are just hugely, hugely important in some of these systems, or at least used to be. They eat a lot of vegetation, or the short-necked turtles in particular also eat a lot of vegetation. All of these turtles eat carrion, and so their ability to be really important scavengers and clean up the waterways is probably something that we've lost in a lot of Australia and a lot of the world, actually. So just to give you an idea of what these numbers look like, if we're starting with those 115 per hectare, this is what we'd look like if we have a 50% decline across these species. If we're catching zero at all, there's probably still some there, but they're just not going into our traps because we haven't put our traps out densely enough or baited them enough or something. They're probably still there, but there's just not many of them. Now, even upstream around here, close to Albury, we've got some sites where we actually have pretty good numbers of turtles, but even here we see what we see. We see an aging population. So we see populations dominated by old adults. This is taken from Bruce's paper again, basically showing his historic data from the 70s. And this is carapace length, so the length of the shell. And your juveniles would be down here, your juveniles and hatchlings. And then as they get bigger, you're getting more of your adults. And now in most of our sites, instead of having this nice wide range of body sizes, we tend to see everybody kind of clustered around these bigger shell sizes. So we don't see very many juvenile turtles anymore at all. It's almost all adults. We think that fox predation is driving these kinds of declines. So this is a map from TurtleSat in Gunbower Creek, and this is a place called Cockatoo Lagoon in north central Victoria. And all the yellow peas are destroyed nests, places where nests have been destroyed by foxes. The solid yellow or solid gold are fences, or not foxes, nests that our collaborator and friend Graham Stockfeld from Turtles Australia has protected from foxes using mesh, which we'll talk about shortly. But you can just see the number of nests that are getting destroyed. And in some places, this is approaching 100% every single year and has done for at least 10 years, probably closer to 20 to 30 years. And we have virtually no hatchlings entering these wetland systems. And what that means is that there's no young turtles to replace the older adults. And if those adults then die of other causes, then we can start to see a population decline. And I want to stress, this is a really unusual thing to happen for turtles. So a female turtle will have somewhere between 10 to 30 eggs per year, we think, on average. And she might do that for somewhere between 20 and 50 years in her lifetime. And so on the top end, let's say 30 eggs per nest and 50 years, that's 1,500 eggs, 1,500 eggs that she can produce in her lifetime. And in order to maintain a stable population, only 2 of those need to survive to adulthood, one to replace her and one to replace at least one of her mates. And for a population to decline on the basis of losing hatchlings or eggs or juveniles alone means you basically have to have nothing for a really long time. And so this is both a problem that is strange and also a problem that is actually potentially easy to fix. If we can just get a few hatchlings out there, we can potentially make a big impact on keeping these populations alive. So when we started seeing this, of course, everybody wants to get rid of foxes, and we have no problem with that. We endorse getting rid of foxes as much as we can. The only issue that we've seen is that lethal fox control has not often been effective. So we've worked with a few management agencies to test how well 1080 baiting works. And we expect something like this. We expect that as we reduce our population, our fox population size, that we'll get some kind of related decrease in our nest destruction rate from 0 to 100%, or from 0 to 1 here. So we expect to see some kind of line like this. When we've done this, what we actually see is this. As our fox activity, and this is our index of number of foxes that we catch on camera per day, as it gets closer to 0, we still have 90 to 100% nest destruction rate. And it's only when we get down to 0 foxes that this relationship actually starts to drop down to 0. And what this indicates is that just one fox is enough to destroy all of the nests in a given population during a single turtle nesting season. And that means that fox control is really, really hard, because we don't just need to control them, we need to eradicate them. And we need to do that across as much area as we can, and we need to do it consistently, because they're just going to pop back into the population. You're going to have new immigrants come in. You're going to have foxes that reproduce more prolifically because there's less competition among them. So there's more food and they can produce more pups. And that means your populations can rebound really quickly. And what this indicates is that fox control just may not be the best thing for us to do unless we can do it 100% completely. This is some data from up near Robinvale and Houston, and just showing you kind of an example of those aging populations that I mentioned before from our 2015 to 2017 surveys. This is looking at shortnecks on the right, or sorry, on the left, It's getting late in the day. And in orange is females. They tend to get bigger than males. And you can see that we've got a decent percentage of our 26 that we caught are really large females. And then we've got some males that are smaller than the females, but this is still really on the big end for males. And then all of our juvenile size classes, we're just not catching anything. Same with our long neck turtles. Now we're not catching as many of those, but no juveniles there at all. I haven't separated the sexes here because long neck turtles are actually really difficult to tell males from females. We're still working on a better way to do that. And it looks like different populations vary in the shell traits that some people have used to tell them apart. So we're not really confident about that just yet. So that is a summary of kind of our background, why we're doing the work that we're doing. And what we've started doing, I've got a couple of projects lined up right now that have just kind of started in the past year. One is developing ways to improve protection of nests for turtles. And that's something that we're doing at a very scientific level, very science focused. We're working with a number of partners across Victoria and New South Wales to just develop and test those techniques. But then we've also got a community engagement and citizen science project called 1 Million Turtles that we're trying to recruit people into, because we need as much help as we can get. When we did that survey across all of the Murray, or most of the Murray, those kinds of things for us get really expensive. It's time away from the teaching that we have to do, that we're contracted to do. It costs a lot of money for the travel and the equipment and all that kind of thing. And every bit of help that we can get from citizen scientists and communities really helps us out, because we can't be everywhere at once. We need help to get those kinds of data. And my collaborator, Ricky Spencer, developed this mobile phone app called TurtleSat to allow people to record any turtles that they see, or any turtle nests that they see. And here's the link for it that hopefully we'll have some time. I'll be able to take you to the app and show you how it works, just because you can do it on a PC as well as on a phone. But I had a look on that just to see, and just from, I know this is kind of zoomed out from the Bellarine Peninsula here, but kind of showing some of your areas, you can see an example of some of the data that we have from your area. And this is something that we'd like to see ramp up as much as we can. All the little green dots, so we've got a couple right there, we've got one here, and a cluster over here by Lismore. Those are our long neck turtles. There's a couple that are blue, so you can see some blue dots over here actually in urban and suburban Melbourne. Those are short necks, which shouldn't actually be there because they're not native to outside of the Murray Basin. They're not in the Melbourne area. So those are probably released pets in that area. Yellow dots are turtles that people haven't been able to identify. They weren't sure what species they were, and that's fine. That's totally fine. And then a gold is a nest. So we've got some here by Lismore. We've got some gold dots over there, which you can see. One's got a P on it, so that's been destroyed by a fox, and then a couple, or it could be anything else, but it's been destroyed. And then there's a couple of intact ones. So what we'd like to start getting is data across the region, and we're doing this across all of Australia. The 1 Million Turtles program is national, and TurtleSat is national, and we're trying to get as much data using this app as we can, because if we start to identify places like this that are clusters, that could be an area that we can target to help for conservation purposes. And if we start getting really good data across the landscape, then we can also start to identify gaps. Because right now, like say, like around this area here between say Cressy and Inverleigh and Colac, there's no data, and we don't know if that means there's no turtles or if there's just been nobody out there looking for them. So we don't know if it's a true zero scientifically or not. So we need a lot more records, and the places where we see a lot of turtles, or we think we can find evidence from the data that turtles are in threat, are places that we can target for conservation. So like I said, an absence of records in a well-reported area, that could indicate a potential local extinction, and that's something that we might be able to work on. And because TurtleSat is a data collection tool, we can share those data both with the people who submit them, and also share communal data with councils and agencies to help. And this is really important. The data provide evidence that something is going on. And the more evidence we have, the more of a story you and an argument you have to take to your council and say, this is a problem and this is something that we'd like to focus on, or an agency, anything like that. I've got two examples I can talk about for that. One is right now I've been working with residents in Meningie, South Australia, to ask council to set up turtle crossing signs, where there's a spot near Meningie where they have just seen long-necked turtle after long-necked turtle get smashed on the road. They want signs up to alert drivers to be more careful. And so that's something that, because we've got evidence from them, we can pass that on to council and give them more emphasis to get those signs up. I've also been doing a lot of work here in Wodonga with Wodonga Council on that, because a few years ago, there was work done on a pond in Wodonga as part of the council's what they were doing was they were doing maintenance on the pond, and when they lowered the water just a little bit, a bunch of the turtles walked out of the pond and they got smashed on the roads. And one of the residents recorded it all on TurtleSat, got a whole bunch of data together, and basically took it to council and said, "Why are you doing this?" And we are working with them now to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen again. Just provide better ways to do it. And it's been great because we're bringing people together, and we're bringing turtles into the spotlight, into the conservation realm, and they're becoming a real target. And it's been really a win-win, because everybody's been able to contribute to improving the situation. So that's the kind of the first step that we're using with this 1 Million Turtles program, is encouraging people to start using TurtleSat a lot more. The second step is finding nesting areas. So again, I'm going to refer to this Cockatoo Lagoon area near Gunbower, where Graham Stockfeld has done so much work over the years. And one of the problems with finding nesting areas is if it's really, really hard to find turtle nests. I cannot emphasize how difficult it is to find them before the foxes get them. Intact turtle nests basically just look like a little small circle of bare dirt that you won't be able to tell from any other circle of bare dirt unless you really, really know what you're looking for. And when I say really, really know, I don't know what they look. I go out looking for them all the time and I can't find them. I've talked to some traditional owners who used to catch them, to catch baby turtles when they were kids, and they said we used to find nests that were not dug up by foxes, and I'd ask them how they did that, and they say, well, you just have to have an eye for it. And that's a really, really hard thing to learn unless you have a lot of nests to look for and find. So we usually find them like this. We usually find a hole in the ground with eggshells scattered around. And that's demoralizing, but it's also really, really important, because just remembering about cockatoo here, we know that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of turtles that are nesting on this beach. Maybe not every year, but most years. And this is a place that now we know where they're nesting, we can target that for protecting nests. And that is really, really useful if we want to get hatchlings out into this system. So I really want to emphasize this, that even if you're going out and you're only finding destroyed turtle nests, if you go out and do this, I know it's painful, but it has to be done. And this is the best way to find nesting hotspots for turtles that we can then target to protect. The next question is, let's say you go out to these places and you look around and you don't find any turtle nests. There's two options, two possibilities. One possibility is that the turtles just aren't nesting there. Maybe there aren't any turtles to nest there, or they don't like that spot. They're nesting somewhere else. The other possibility is that the foxes aren't eating the nests. And again, this is really hard to know for sure unless you are very, very good at finding those intact nests. One thing I should have added a slide in here is what to look for nesting grounds. If I go back here and look at this image, this is a very open canopy area. So they don't like places that are forested usually, or it has to have at least some gaps in the canopy for the sunlight to penetrate through. This is an agricultural field, so it's set up for producing hay. There's sprinklers all over, and it gets hayed a couple of times a year. I'm not exactly sure how frequently, and then it has cattle in there the rest of the year. And that provides an area that has some grass, not very tall grass. They don't like a lot of bushes, but they will nest kind of under bushes. Sometimes they'll back the back of the shell under the nest and dig a hole there. But generally speaking, we're talking about open canopy areas that get a lot of sun, little vegetation, or at most some grass, maybe a couple bushes. And the sandier, the better. They really like sand. It's easy to dig in, but they will, like you can see here, this is more of a clay with even some gravel. They will dig in that if they have to. So the soil type doesn't matter as much, doesn't seem to matter as much as the vegetation. But if they have a nice kind of sandy hillside with no trees on it and some short grass or short vegetation like that, those places seem to be what they really, really like. You can also see they tend to like this north to northwest facing slope. They're going over here on this southeast facing slope, but there's a lot more over here, and there aren't many facing due south. So that probably is getting better sun exposure most of the year, or most of the summer especially. But let's say you have these two options. You aren't finding any turtle nests, dead or alive. You aren't sure if they're there. How do you know what they're doing? You could go out and look for the turtles nesting. But again, if there's no turtles, you may not see them, or if you don't catch them at the right time, you may not see them. What we recommend doing is using artificial nests with chicken eggs. And this is something that we have done every time we've been testing these fox management strategies. If we know there's a good turtle nesting area, we'll incorporate those data as well. But we use artificial nest plots to really get good data on the effectiveness of these fox controls, because we know how many nests that we put out there, and then we can easily tell how many get destroyed. So when we do this, we set up a square plot. We're providing training on this on the 1 Million Turtles website. It's a 20 by 20 meter plot, and then we ask people to put in 10 nests, each with 2 chicken eggs. It approximates the size of and nutritional value of a turtle nest, and foxes love it. Doesn't make any difference to the fox. It's an egg smell. It smells like an egg. They'll dig it up right away and eat them most of the time. We have seen a couple of places recently where, at least in the winter, these haven't been destroyed by foxes, but in places like Gunbower, they'll get these within 24 hours, very, very quick. Once you dig them in, we also put in flags at each of the nests so that we know where the nests are. And then we take a picture of the plot from each one of these 4 corners. And that way we know where the nest should be. We go back in, we remove all of those flags, and then we leave. We might set up a remote camera trap. So when those infrared cameras, you want to face this towards the south so that it's not getting direct sun, which can trigger it. Ideally, you don't want to have any vegetation that will wave in the wind and trigger the camera too. And like I said, in most of the studies that we do, we'll get foxes destroying these nests within at least a week, sometimes as fast as 24 hours. And the camera will tell us whether it's a fox or something else. Some places get other animals. Occasionally, you get ravens and magpies digging these up, especially if turtles nest during the day, they'll do that. There's been reports of echidnas digging up turtle nests sometimes. But it's almost always foxes that get them first. I've had people ask me about goannas sometimes, and I've had goannas walk through these nest plots and not paying them any mind at all. But foxes will get them every single time. In the Edward River in New South Wales this year, for the first time, we've actually had some success potentially with the 1080 stuff, knocking back the foxes. Potentially enough, maybe. I'm really hopeful. But we actually had pigs come in and some of the pigs started digging them up. So it seems like if we get one thing done, there's another thing that's going to do it. But as I said, this is something we do, but it's something that we can only be in so many places at once. And this is kind of an ideal or an example map of where we've been able to do this kind of a work. And so we're really asking for as much help as we can get from people. This is something that anybody can do. It's so easy. It's so easy to do. But in order to participate in our program, it does require a little bit of training in order to be approved by the Western Sydney University Animal Ethics. So this is being done under their purview. And that is available on our website, which I'll show you in a minute, how to go through that training program. But all you really need is access to land that will allow you to do this. So whether it's land you own or a family member or a friend owns and will allow you to use, or whether you can get permission from your local council, something like that. And that's something that we are happy to help have a conversation with anybody. The only thing we can't do it on is we can't do it on any national parks or Vic parks type managed lands, just because we don't have permits to that level. In order to just do this, we can use animal ethics on private land, but for parks, we need more permits. So I'm just going to click on the website and go over to that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and reshare it once I get this website up, just to show you what this looks like. Can everybody see this now? This website?
Yes, we
so
can.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So this is the homepage. This is, if you go to 1millionturtles.com, this is what you see. And we have a couple of links to a number of different things you can do. You can see our team, you can get involved, you can see some of our events and workshops and our newsletters. The podcast is something that we are still developing. There's a lot of stuff that we're still in the process of doing, but this National Nest Predation Survey is the big thing that I'm focusing on now. And if you click on that, basically it runs you through kind of the reasoning why we're doing this, why you need to train in the first place. You know, why do you need all this animal ethics stuff to tell you why, to give you permission to do this? And this is all the information that we provide. And it's just a way for us to cover ourselves and making sure that we're doing everything as by the book as we can, and make sure that we're supporting all of you or whoever's doing this as well. So we have an equipment list of what you need. We have some personal safety stuff, so like disposable gloves and wipes and a first aid kit, and then things to set up the actual survey site. There's things that you don't need, so you can use a hand trowel to dig the nest holes, or you can use an auger or a electric drill auger if you have one. You can use a 30-meter tape or a shorter tape measure to measure these, or sometimes you can just walk it out. So 20 strides, that's close enough. It's good enough for our purposes. If you have access to a wildlife camera, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. We'll still get data on how fast the nests get destroyed. And we can help you with a number of other things there. We've got a risk assessment that we ask everybody to do. Again, it's just making sure that everything's done safely, and that everything, we just want to make sure that nothing happens, nothing bad happens. And then a whole lot of instructions on how to do it. And then you have to do a quiz in order to be certified. It's just a really short 10-question quiz. Shouldn't take anybody any time at all. It's meant to be easy. It's meant to be permissive, so that you've just been kind of covered to do this. And then we have some additional tips and a bit of a workshop, which I'm repeating some of the information from that here. So you may not need to have a look at that. You can see the picture here of the flags set up and the camera, and those flags again are marking the sites of the nests, so that we can then pull the flags out, leave, and come back and record the data. There's also a research paper there giving some more explanation for why we're doing what we're doing. And then on TurtleSat, if I go to that website, you will not be able to see how to enter that data right away. So if we go click on add data, you can do, this is because I'm logged in still. Yeah, I'm still logged in. So you'll see this National Nest Predation Survey, and that is so you can add what you've set up for your nest. So you have your start date and time, the end date and time. We're asking people to do this for about 3 weeks to have it out. You can click on the map to identify your coordinates. You don't have to put those in, so just anywhere. And then we're assuming you've put up 10 nests, you've installed 10 nests. And so after it's done, you enter the number of nests destroyed and the number of days that if you had a camera up that took pictures of foxes, you can put in the number of days that foxes were observed. And that's all there is to it. While I'm here, just to show you TurtleSat again, you can also add data for a turtle sighting or a nest location. And this shows you all the data that are currently publicly available. So you can see that there's quite a lot throughout most of Australia. We've got a little bit here around Perth, and then a fair amount here in our southeast region, just as an example of what it looks like. Let me just go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, the next thing, so that's everything that we have kind of set up and running right now. The next thing that I'll talk about that'll be the next thing that's coming with 1 million turtles is how to protect nests. So the turtles usually nest in spring, usually the first big rain across the whole region, sometimes between late October and early December. I think Andrew was saying at his area, it was late November, like the 20th to the 25th that he typically gets them. I've recently talked to some folks in South Australia around Murray Bridge that didn't have their long neck nest this year until January, which is really late. Must have been a really dry season to have that happen. But anyway, they can nest at any point during that time, usually associating with some with a downpour or rainstorm. I've talked about they usually prefer sandy banks close to the water's edge with shorter grass, but they do wander sometimes with these long necks. So this isn't necessarily going to be 100% of the time. They might do something strange every now and then. So I'm keeping an open mind. If you find a turtle nest in a new location, totally happy to have a look at that. What we recommend doing is if you see a turtle nesting, so this is a short neck, you can see she's got some dirt piled up. The most important thing is to keep your distance until she finishes. Turtles will, if they're still in the process of digging the hole, they will freeze and they will hold still until you leave. And they're patient. They will wait there for hours until you leave. And as soon as you leave, if they haven't actually started laying their eggs, they will run away and they'll leave that nest, and you'll just find a hole in the ground. If we're optimistic, we'll say that she came out here to test the nest. This doesn't hurt the turtle or the eggs in any way. They would do this in response to any kind of potential threat. They'll just go back to the water. They'll wait until they get a chance again, and then they'll come out and lay the eggs the next chance they get. So it doesn't hurt them at all to abandon a nest if they feel threatened. If they've started laying their eggs, they go into a little bit of a trance. And this is really interesting because this has been documented with all the turtles in the world that have been studied. Sea turtles is really well known that you can just basically pull the eggs out as they drop out of the female. And a lot of people who protect sea turtle eggs will do that. With these turtles, I have unfortunately found sometimes when they're in this trance state, they stick their heads and their necks out of their shell like this. And I have found turtles where a fox has just come by and nipped their head clean off while they've been laying their eggs. And it's a really sad thing to come across, but unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do it. But it just demonstrates the kind of state of mind that they're in. Once they go into the egg laying phase, it's driven by a hormone called arginine vasotocin, which is similar to our oxytocin, and it just takes them over. And they just sit there until they've dropped all their eggs. Once they finish nesting or laying their eggs, she will then pull the dirt back into the hole, and then she will do push-ups, and she will tamp the soil down with her plastron, the belly of her shell. So you want to keep your distance while a turtle's nesting until she actually finishes and leaves. I'd say at least 20 meters. You want to be able to visually see where she's nesting, let her finish, let her go on her way, and then find that spot. And if you find that spot and it looks like there's a solid plug in the ground, again, it'll look like something small and circular. That's going to be a successful nest. If you have permission to do so, and this is something that we're going to hopefully have a training program on 1 million turtles for soon. We're just getting it through animal ethics right now. If you have permission to, you can then cover the nest. So this is an example with some plastic mesh that you can use. We are starting to recommend metal mesh instead of plastic because there's a few places like Gunbower where this has been done for years, where the foxes have figured out how to break through this plastic mesh. And I had a student actually this year who actually showed on camera a fox picking this plastic straight off the mesh. So we put it down with 6 to 8 tent pegs or U-shaped pegs around the margin of the mesh, and this fox just ripped it clean off. So they're starting to figure out how to get through this in areas where it's been used a lot, and we're starting to look at metal mesh instead as an alternative. And they can also bite through this if they really figure it out. We didn't see that. Graham didn't see that in Gunbower until about 2017 in the middle of the last drought we had. Before that, this worked fine. After that, it started to get worse. So this is a learning process that we have to continually adapt with alongside the foxes. Once you've protected it, we then ask that you enter that nest on TurtleSat. And then we also ask that you leave the nest alone. This is another one of those animal ethics things and permitting issues that we we know that the hatchlings are potentially at risk until they dig out, but we prefer to let them do that on their own, just because we can't provide permission for people to actually pick up the babies and move them. Once you start interacting with them at that level, that requires a lot more oversight that our program just cannot provide. And so we cannot authorize people to do that with the training that we're going to be offering. They do make their way to the water pretty quickly. As small as they are, we did some radio tracking studies with baby short-necked turtles a couple of years ago in South Australia, and they can swim over a kilometer in 24 hours, which when you think about a little 4 or 5 gram turtle, they can really move. So they're probably, especially if they come out at night, they're probably a little bit safer than we give them credit for once they hatch. It's the nests that are the most vulnerable. Now, there may be exceptions to that. You're always going to lose a few, but as long as the majority of the babies get to the water, that's the important thing. Now, the other option that requires a little bit more investment, but we're working through it in the grant project. The other project that I mentioned is using fences to protect entire nesting beaches. This is an example that a landholder in Narrung in South Australia, so against Lake Alexandrina, has set up with help from the Strathalbyn Naturalists Club. So they installed a chain mesh fence around the perimeter of this area. The lake is right here, and you can see these kind of marshy areas where there's some reeds. So it's keeping the foxes out successfully, which is really cool. The fence itself is a 2-meter high chain mesh fence. It's got 2 lines of electric wire. It's got one along the base and one along the top, and that's powered by a solar unit. And then the wings of the fence extend into the water, but the front of it, the water-facing front, is open to the water. When they set up the fence, they also cut some gaps through the reeds, and turtles will bust their way through the reeds if they need to. But if you provide a gap like this for them, they are creatures of least resistance, and they are happy to go through those gaps if you make them for them. The landowner also very wisely, this was not an idea that we had, but is a really cool idea, put in some sand plots not to attract the turtles to nest, but this actually tracks the turtles as they wander up. And so she goes out there and she counts their footprints to see how many are going through. And that's been really, really useful for her to get an idea of how many turtles she's got nesting in there after they've established that. It's a really good idea. And then she's been putting camera traps inside and outside of the fence. This was a known nesting area before the fence was put in, so she'd already seen shortnecks, mainly shortnecks, a few longnecks nesting there, but that's why they put the fence around that area as a known nesting area, and the turtles have continued to nest in that enclosure since it's been built, which is really cool. And again, they're seeing the nesting turtles using the gaps through the reeds, and she's getting the tracks through the sand. And then also this is off of the one of those remote cameras. You can see the rear end of this short-necked turtle. And I didn't notice before, this short-necked turtle actually has a really interesting shell deformity. That bend up there is not normal. It's probably something that happened during development, but you can see she's doing just fine with it. She's a really good size. That's probably a 30 or 40-year-old turtle with that. Now, we're not sure how many nests have been laid in there, but the landholder has been finding intact nests, which is really good. And you can see that some of the results of the incubation, she's had some successful hatchlings that she's found. So we've got some short-necked turtles there and some long-neck turtles there. Or no, I'm sorry. These are all short-necks that she's finding. So that's really cool. Some of the problems she's run into, the sand beds they're not really long enough to record all nesting activity. I think she only has 2 or 3 of them laid out. So she gets some. She's had a little bit of an invasion of purple swamp hens, native bird, but they've come in through the gap in the reeds. They would normally just be in the reedy bits, but they've started coming into coming onto land there. There's been a few swamp rats, so a native rat species that have increased, and they haven't been a problem for the turtles, but she started noticing them getting to the roots of her shrubs and other native bushes that she's planted. And some of those hatchling turtles have been eaten. So this is one of those purple swamp hens wandering off with a baby turtle. So not all of them make it, but we just have to remember that the majority majority of these baby turtles probably won't, but as long as a couple of them get through, that's still a lot more than what we see when the entire nest gets destroyed by foxes. One of the problems also is that the lake level dropped, and so the fence had to be extended further out. So just a brief summary of that site so far. That exclusion fencing seems to be working. She isn't finding as many nests destroyed. You really need to identify the nesting areas before putting in a fence like this, at least a year ahead of time. So just knowing that this is an area that the turtles are using is really, really important for knowing that your fence is going to work. You have to monitor it closely during and after nesting season to be able to see where the nests are, and so that you know where they've been protected. And if you want to see the babies emerge, you can find them afterwards. There's some really good ideas here for adapting the fence area to local conditions. So learning how to put in this sandy runway to monitor the activity is really, really smart, really good idea. And putting in the runway through the reeds also helps helps the turtles navigate to the place that you've protected. I actually want to test this at a site here in Wodonga, where I'm working with a partner to basically plant reeds along the entire margin of a wetland except in the fenced area, so that we kind of guide them, as many of them as possible, to the beach that we fenced off. And then you do need to keep an eye on unintended consequences. A similar unintended consequence that was recorded in Perth, in WA anyway, where they excluded all the predators around a wetland with an anti-predator fence. All the foxes were kept out. Their bandicoot population actually boomed, and the bandicoots then became a problem for the turtles, the turtle nests. So again, there's always potential unintended consequences of everything that we do, and we just need to keep those in mind for making sure we do the best we can. And one of the real neat outcomes here is we've got local landholders, community groups, citizen scientists coming together to get this working. And the Strathalbyn Naturalist Club got the money for the fence from the federal government through a landholder grant to improve environmental outcomes. So again, there's a lot of really good things coming from projects like this. One of the other things I just want to note, and I'll go back to this, that I was down at this site in June, and if I go back to the map, it was really interesting. Pam is the landholder. She took us on a walk, and we walked all around, and we saw something we've never seen before. Scattered throughout this landscape, not a very big area, but just scattered around, were skink eggs. They're robust skinks, Tenotus robustus, and all the eggs had hatched, and they're just these empty eggshells just scattered all over the place. And I've never seen anything like that. And I was with one of my collaborators who's a very senior reptile ecologist. He's been around for a long time, named Mike Thompson, and he hadn't seen anything like that before either. And so we think that not only are the turtles benefiting from that lack of foxes, but those skinks may also be benefiting. And the foxes probably wouldn't be eating the eggs, but because you don't have as many foxes, the adult skinks are surviving better, and they're just maybe laying a lot more eggs. So that's a really neat other positive unintended consequence of this that really kind of caught our eye, and something we want to go back and see if there's anything to that. But it was just remarkable, because I think we found about probably 20 or 30 eggshells just scattered around. I've just never seen anything like that before. Okay, so that's everything I've got. I just want to remind everybody, if you really are interested in this, please check out our website. And we also have 1 Million Turtles and TurtleSat pages on Facebook and Twitter. We have the links to the websites. We're going to be releasing a new newsletter coming out in August, where we're going to talk to probably Turtles Albury Wodonga about some of the success that they've had with their nest predation survey. And I'm also going to be advertising in that newsletter opportunities to volunteer on some of our field sites, because I've got a small team of students, and we're going to be spread out pretty thin come November, looking for turtle nesting activity and trying to be out protecting nests. And that's something that we'll be looking for some help with. If you're close to some of our sites, we'd really like to get people out, and we can provide training on how to protect nests at that point too. Also, November is Turtle Month because it's associated with nesting activity. That's something that we've been pushing really hard for the past few years. And so around Turtle Month, we will probably have a launch of more stuff on the 1 Million Turtles program, especially around nest protection. Hopefully it's been through all of our animal ethics at that point and we're able to move it forward. So I really thank Sophie for the invitation, and I thank all of you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Sorry, Sophie, you're still muted.
Thank you, James. That was absolutely fascinating. And maybe we need to rethink our revegetation around the farm dams if long-necked turtles actually like open habitat.
Maybe, yeah. Worth having a look at anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. We've got a few questions in the chat box. So maybe we'll start off with those and then people can unmute themselves, or people can feel free to unmute themselves and put on their cameras now to ask any further questions. But we've got a question from Bernie who questioned the high level of salinity. You know, how does salinity affect turtles?
That's a great question. Let me find a good map to go by for that. The short answer is yes, it's not great for them. But actually, I'll start with this. Long-necked turtles of the species in Australia are actually the most robust to high salinity. And there's actually been some research, some direct research that's been done on this, which is really cool, which is not something you see every day. But because they have unusually, for a freshwater turtle, they have unusually thick skin. And we think that's an adaptation to being able to walk from wetland to wetland, sometimes quite large distances. And so it also gives them a little bit of a benefit to surviving in high salinity, relatively high salinity environments. So we know that they can do it at least to a degree. Now, some sites, if I go to the map, if we get kind of hypersaline or almost ocean levels of salinity, it won't kill them right away, but they won't survive very long in it. They'll be okay for a day or two, or hours, maybe a week at the most. But what we typically see happen is if they've been really waterlogged in seawater for a long time, I mean, turtles do get washed out in the ocean sometimes. It helps to put them in fresh water and just get them to rehydrate and flush out the salt for a little bit. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned, because I haven't heard of it in Victoria, but happened over here in the lower lakes back in the Millennium Drought in South Australia, is it got salty enough in the lower lakes that there was a marine tube worm that came into the lower lakes and became quite active. And it actually killed a lot of turtles because it encrusted on their shells, and it basically turned them into blocks of concrete, and they would sink to the bottom and drown. So there were community groups in Goolwa who were basically getting paint scrapers, and they were scraping off the marine tube worm infestations on those turtles. So that's been a bigger threat than just regular salinity. Now, in the Murray system, where we get some saline wetlands at certain times of year when they get a bit dry, the long-necked turtles will use those when they're fresher, but as soon as they start to get very saline, they just walk out and they move to a different wetland. So it's not great for them, but it's something that they have ways to deal with, is I think the best way I would answer that question.
So do the long-necked turtles walk further than the other species?
Oh yeah, like short necks will barely walk 10 meters on land. They'll do it when they come out to nest, but you almost never see them out on land. In fact, I've been working at some wetlands on the Edward River, right close to that dot right there in New South Wales, where we have been tracking them with acoustic tags that they use for fish monitoring. And the short-necked turtles just they swim. They don't walk unless they absolutely have to. And the long-necked turtles are just very different and unique in that way.
Okay. And what other ways can we identify the turtles if we find one? Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good question. Probably if we look at the long necks, I should have put a good picture on this, but they've got these black borders on their plastron. And it actually, if I go to the baby one, you can see it really well. So the babies have this orange on them and they've got this black. The orange fades to a yellow, white, cream, something like that color, but this black stays. And none of the other turtles in Australia have black, or none of the ones in the Murray or in Victoria, New South Wales, down in our region have that black marking on the plastron, the bottom shell. The carapace, the dorsal shell, you can see it's got this kind of upturned fringe on the sides, and that is very characteristic of long-necked turtles. So only long-necked turtles have that upturned fringe like that. The broad shells, if you see one of those, they have a very kind of vertically smashed head. They're a very flat head, and they're really big. So these broadshell turtles, the biggest one I've caught was close to 7 kilos. The shell was over 400 millimeters long, and the neck was another 300 millimeters. So you're looking at a turtle that's almost a meter long in its total length. They're really, really big. So you're not likely to confuse those. And these are very rarely seen. The only time people really see them is when they come out to nest. And then the short necks, compared to the other two, have short necks. So they don't have big long neck like the others. They have this really kind of chunky head. They have kind of a greenish color, whereas the long necks tend to be more brown or black. Broad shell's also kind of brown. The short necks are noticeably green with these bright greenish yellow eyes, and they have this really prominent stripe on their neck. They might also have a white mark behind the eye. That varies. Some have it, some don't. But that's a good way to tell them apart. If you only find a dead shell, you can see that the broad shell has these two scoots kind of in the front like that. And the short necks, I don't have a picture of it, but the short necks don't have those two out front. Their shell structure is a bit different. But if you're not sure, please just take a picture of it and send it to 1 Million Turtles or TurtleSat or me or anybody on our project, and we'll be happy to try to get an answer back to you if you're not sure.
Yeah, James, and you mentioned that turtles can, or the eastern neck turtles at least, can breed for up to 50 years. How long can they actually live?
We don't know. In captivity, there's records that are approaching 100 years. So that's kind of the maximum limit that we're aware of. In the wild, it could be anything up to that, really. I guess one other thing I should mention about how to identify them is if it stinks. I know that's a common thing people always talk about, stinky turtles. It's a long neck. These two do not stink. They all have glands. It's not their pee that stinks. Their pee is almost all water, but they have these glands on either side of the bridge of the shell. So this is the bridge that connects the carapace to the plastron. All three species, every species of turtle has those glands, but in Australia, or at least Southeast Australia, only the eastern longneck has a really pungent odor to the musk that comes out of those glands. These two have an odor, but it really just smells like river to me. It kind of smells like what I would say a typical swamp smells like, but the eastern longnecks are the only ones that really sting the nostrils.
Yeah, and anybody who's tried to help them across the road will have will have found that out. Yeah, and it stays on your hands for quite a few days despite vigorous washing.
Yep.
And there's a question from Emma about reintroducing turtles onto the Bellarine. And I mean, in fact, we do have long neck turtles locally. People have observed them.
Let me go.
And so I don't, well, you might be able to say more about that, but I'm not sure that it's a matter of reintroducing them, but rather becoming aware, contributing to citizen science and to the TurtleSat, and to just working out ways we can conserve the ones that are here.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And it's something that we're playing around with in a couple of different ways. One of the options for getting a lot of baby turtles out is to incubate the eggs in captivity. So that's something that we could potentially do, because you take them totally away from the foxes, and we could potentially, and this is something we're kind of starting to work on, figure out like the ideal environmental conditions to incubate eggs to get the very best baby turtles that we can. So like the perfect temperature, the perfect moisture level, things like that, the best soil, any of those kinds of variables. The trouble with it right now is, especially in Victoria, there's very strict rules against animal translocations, and that includes breeding animals and releasing them. And it's for good reasons. The rules are in place right now to basically try to prevent let's say you're going to develop a place and you've found an endangered species in that location. Well, something that could be done is to just move that endangered species somewhere else, and that's a translocation. So it's meant to try to prevent that in all but the most careful circumstances. And it's also meant to avoid introducing diseases into populations or moving diseases around. And so that's something that I've got a student working on right now to see what the risk is of, if we bring turtle eggs into captivity, is there a risk of us introducing new different bacteria to the eggs compared to what they would have in the wild? So I've got a student working on that, and hopefully it gives us an idea about what those risks, those biosecurity risks are. Something I haven't talked about in this presentation, but should mention on that point, is that back in 2015, about 7 years ago now, there was a mass die-off of turtles in the Bellarine River in New South Wales. There's a species that's endemic to that river called the Bellarine River snapping turtle. And there's a virus, ironically, a type of coronavirus that appeared in that river in 2015, and it killed almost every single adult Bellarine River turtle. There's about 4,000 at the time the disease hit, and now there's only a couple of hundred, and they're mostly juveniles. We were involved to get into that system and bring some of the survivors in for a breeding program at a couple of zoos in New South Wales. But because of those kinds of events, everybody's a little bit careful about introducing turtles back in areas, just to be sure that we don't inadvertently put some kind of bug in with them. So that's just something we have to be really careful about.
James, is there an age when baby turtles become more resilient and able to cope with the foxes?
That's a good question. To cope with the foxes, all they really have to do is get to the water. Once they're in the water, they're pretty safe from the foxes and also any predators on land. They would still be vulnerable to fish and birds in particular, and potentially ricali, water rats. But we don't know for sure. We think their survival rate goes up tremendously once they get to the water, or even once they hatch out and they start making their way down to the water, as long as they're close by. We don't know that for sure. Baby turtles are really, because they're difficult to find, are difficult to study. One of the things that we want to get out of the projects we're doing right now, so protecting nests and seeing how well the nest protection works, is hopefully if we get a bunch of baby turtles out, we can actually study them. So we've got plans to do some radio tracking of babies, which the batteries last on them about 20 to 30 days because they're not very big. They can't be very big to put on a baby turtle. But we're going to be doing that, as well as some marker capture and trapping surveys to see if we can figure out where they go and what they do, and hopefully get a better idea of how long they survive as well.
Yeah, great. And I had the privilege of actually seeing a female turtle laying eggs in Indented Head next to a wetland on Dyke. And then probably about 12 months later, I was walking along the footpath, and there was a baby turtle coming towards me just not far from that spot, and about the size of my thumbnail.
It's very cool. Yeah.
And I said to him, "You can't be walking on the footpath." So I kind of put him in next to the wetland, and hoped he would be safe in there.
Yeah.
But how long does it take between when the eggs are laid and when the young hatch?
Yep. That depends on species. For long necks, you're looking at probably in good conditions, like a perfect temperature, about 100 to 120 days. The short necks are faster. They can hatch in 50 to 70, but the long necks take a little bit longer. And they will often, long necks especially, because that's so late in the season, or can be so late, it's not unusual for them to then stay in the nest. The babies will stay in the nest until the next spring. And it seems like, again, rainfall is a trigger because it softens the soil, makes it easier to dig out. So they'll just wait there for the rain. They hatch with a fair amount of yolk left over. We call it residual yolk, and that provides them with all the nutrients and energy that they need to just sit and wait it out. And there's some records that they might be able to survive up to, well, probably not quite a year after hatching, but probably until into the middle of summer or so, before they have to eat. So they're pretty hardy, they're pretty resilient, as long as nothing digs them up and eats them.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. And Bernie was asking about cats. Have you
Mhm.
seen, impacts from cats?
We've never had a cat dig up a nest. I think that as a predator, cats are much more attuned to visual cues and things that move. And so I don't think we need to worry about them for nests. It's possible they could be a threat to baby turtles, maybe even a decent sized juvenile if it came out on land. But we haven't seen cats be a big issue for turtles yet. Hopefully that means that they're not much of an issue. But maybe when we start tracking baby turtles, maybe we'll start to see something around that, but don't think it's a big problem. One thing I didn't mention, I should have, it's neglectful of me, is roads. So, or I mentioned roads can be a problem a little bit, but let me just go back to the Bellarine. So we also collect data on TurtleSat based on how many turtles get smashed. And one of the things that you can do if you see a turtle crossing a road and it's still alive, and if it's, I have to emphasize, if it's safe to do so, the best thing to do is to move it in the direction it's heading. So we don't want to take it to a wetland away from where its home range is. It's best to just move it across the road, let it go on its merry way on the direction it was heading. One of the things, because of their age, to remember is the turtle might be older than the road is. So it's possible that it's been crossing that particular patch of ground for decades, and it's only just recently relative to the turtle's life that the road has popped up. So it's best to just move them across. That's something that we talked to permitting wildlife license agencies about, and they said, it's not the best thing to be interacting with the animal, but you don't want to get it smashed on the road. So if it's safe for people to do so, that's probably okay. They don't think that they would go after somebody for doing it. I, don't take my word for it, but I think that's something that's okay to do if it's safe to do so.
MR said, what do they eat and how do we encourage them to come to our dams?
Yeah, they eat basically any small animal, any little insect or invertebrate, small fish, small tadpoles, yabbies, things like that. So if there's any kind of underwater life in your pond, in your dam, that would be potential food for them. So probably the best way to encourage them is to plant native aquatic vegetation that your native insects and other invertebrate animals like. So all that kind of stuff will make the water more attractive. Now that said, I think any kind of water, any kind of wetland has potential to have turtles going to it. I spoke to a farmer in, where was it? Hopeton, Victoria, I think it was. He called me on the phone because they had a little a garden pond in their yard, and apparently for whatever reason, I maybe because of water rules, a lot of the farmers had been pressured to bulldoze their dams in that region, and when all the water resources disappeared, there was a bunch of long necks that just flocked to this guy's garden pond, and apparently because it was the only water available. So I think that they're really, really good at finding water sources. And if you have a dam, you probably have turtles in it, even if you don't see them. There's a lot of places I've worked where people tell me, oh, I've never seen turtles in there, and I throw a trap in and I catch 20. So they can be very cryptic. They aren't things that you necessarily see. One thing you can try to do to increase your sightings of them is, if you have a dam and you're willing to do so, put something they can bask on, so a log or a floating platform or something like that. And they might occasionally in the year come out and sit on that to bask in the sun. They're still pretty shy when they bask, so you may not see them for very long, but if you walk up to it, you might see them sitting there and then drop down into the water. And they do, if enough people go to it, they do get used to people. There's a spot here in Albury at the Yinjimara Sculpture Walk, which actually goes around a sewage settling pond. It's full of turtles. They love it. They love dirty water. It's nasty, nasty water that's unsafe to be in, but for humans, but the turtles love it. And because they're used to people there in the springtime, I often see in the hundreds basking on the logs at that spot. So that's another thing we're working with some councils to do, is put in basking logs so that people can actually see the turtles and report them to us on TurtleSat.
Yeah, well, one of the landholders who kind of kicked off this project observed about 3 long-necked turtles, young ones. They would have been young ones because they had the orange was very distinctive on them. Float, sort of just bask. Just they kind of just are under the water, but you can just basically see a little bit of the top of their shells, and then their nose is sticking up, and then some bubbles. And yeah, so he was observing that soon after he fenced off his dam, and that was the first time he'd actually observed turtles on the property, though he'd been there for all his life. So yeah, so they are often there, but as you say, quite cryptic.
Yeah. And that's a good point too. When they're in the water, they do have to come up. Well, some of them can do underwater breathing through their bum, but it's only when the water's really, really clean. But they do have to come up to breathe most of the time. And one thing that I've noticed is in places where there's a lot of turtles, like sometimes you'd be wading in the water, setting traps, and you're going to catch a lot if you just see turtle heads everywhere. And they seem to be kind of curious, and they just pop up and they look at you, and they're skittish, but they're checking you out and seeing what you're doing. And those are always the places that we come back, after 12 hours and we've got 40 turtles to deal with. I see there's a question about if you found a shell, does that mean you might have turtles? And MR, yep, that's a good indicator that you probably have turtles somewhere. So it could be a fox that's killed it, or it could have died of old age or disease or anything. It's hard to tell what would have caused that. But if you do have a shell that you found, then yes, you probably do have at least a few turtles around. As an example, that the place I mentioned at the beginning of the talk where we didn't catch any over 5 days, Calperum Station, we found turtle shells around the bank there. So they're definitely around, but they're just in really low numbers, so low that we weren't actually catching them in the traps.
Okay, great. And Bernie also asked, do they survive in
intermittent waterways? Yep. Yeah, so long-necked turtles in particular really like intermittent waterways. They really like wetlands that dry and flood. And when it floods, they'll move in, and when it dries out, they move out, and they just move around the landscape from pond to pond, wetland to wetland, as they fill in. Actually, as an example of that, if I go back to my big map, there's a spot here. This actually exactly where this dot is, right in outside Deniliquin. I've been studying that spot for a few years now, and I saw a wetland. I've seen it go through a couple of dry and flood cycles now. And when it dries up, I've seen it go down to about knee height. And when it's flooded, it can be about 3.5 meters deep at its deepest point. When it was down to knee level, so we're trapping it over and over. We have acoustic telemetry arrays in the wetland. When it's dry down to knee level, there's one long neck that we caught over and over and over again. And so I'm pretty sure that there's just one turtle that was still in there. Then when it flooded, the very next season, we caught over 100 long necks. So they just came in from all over. And since it flooded, a little bit later, the tagged short necks came in. So we didn't catch them right away, but we knew through the telemetry that they were slowly moving in. And the last time I was there, we had about a 50-50 balance. So about 50-50 short necks and long necks. The long necks went down from 100 to about 30, and then we'd had an influx of short necks. So there's about 30 there. So there's definitely some movement. They don't like to stay in one place for any long time, but they really like it when it's freshly flooded.
Emma also asks, can we protect a small dam with a smaller height than 2 meters?
Do you mean like the water depth is smaller than 2 meters? Or shallower than 2 meters?
Yeah, I guess that's what.
No, the fence height.
Fence.
Oh, a fence shorter than 2 meters. Maybe. I think if you put the concern that I've always heard about shorter fences with foxes is that they might be able to climb or jump over that. But I think if the top line, or if you have an electric line running along the top, that would stop that pretty well, I think. Don't quote me on it. The other thing you can do is, I've seen this on some places with kangaroo fences, is you can loop the outside edge over. So you have you have vertical fence, and then it comes over and loops over so that if anything tries to jump, it hits that wall. Something like that might work, but I just can't vouch for how well it will work.
How high were the fences that your landholder that you spoke about?
Those are 2 meters, and I've seen some that were taller than that, but that's about the shortest that I've seen. So since it's working with that electric line, that's something I would say that looks good to me. But again, it's new. These are new things that we're testing, and so we're still working out those kinds of details. There might be something less expensive that is doable too.
Yeah.
We just need to find it.
I was reading that you were also looking at floating islands for nesting spots.
Yep.
Has that been, has there been any progress on that?
There's nothing I can report on that yet, but thanks for mentioning that, Sophie. So the idea with the floating islands is in wetlands, where we can't put in a fence or something like that, we can set up a floating platform with soil beds that the turtles are willing to nest on. Now, we've done one very short trial of that in the Blue Mountains, and we did have a couple of long necks actually nest on it, but it started to waterlog and sink. So we're working on better designs that will stay floating, that won't get waterlogged. The big problem is figuring out a way to have a tub that contains the soil, but then allows the water to drain through if it rains or something like that, without it also having the water come up from the bottom. So there's some details that we're just figuring out there, but the aim is if they nest on it, hopefully the foxes don't recognize what it is right away. If the foxes do recognize it, hopefully we can move it around so it's not in the same place. And maybe they won't swim to it. Also, these are all things that we're still figuring out with that idea.
Yeah. Those foxes are extremely intelligent and very challenging to try and manage. Kate's asked about any turtle tunnels being used under roads.
Hasn't been done in Australia yet. It's been trialed in Canada and in I think in Europe. And the weird thing about it is that turtles seem very reluctant to cross under tunnels for whatever reason where it's been done. There might be differences with these turtles. I'm actually working with Northeast Water, which is a sewage treatment company here in Northeast Victoria. They actually get some long neck turtles stuck in some of their pipes in their treatment facilities sometimes. And so I'm working with them to figure out how and why that's happening and how to stop it. So maybe our turtles would be willing to go through a tunnel under a road. But the limited work that's been done with it so far looks like it might not be the best thing because they just don't like the looks of a dark, shadowy tunnel to walk through. So it's definitely an idea worth pursuing, but we're just not quite there yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, if there's no further questions, we might draw it to a close there. Any further questions? I might just switch off the recording.